In the 1630s, after the establishment of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and after you had a growing number of people who were disenfranchised with the religious persecution that the Puritans put on display in the theocracy there, not wanting to be governed by a particular religious entity, and also perhaps in search of more fertile land west of Boston, you have a number of folks led by Thomas Hooker who would establish a colony about 100 miles west of Boston on the Connecticut River Valley. They established a community that we now know today as Hartford, Connecticut. And in doing so, they would establish a new colony, Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, establishing modern day Connecticut as a refuge for people looking for a new fertile opportunity to grow outside of the rocky outcrop around Boston, and an escape from religious persecution from puritanical thought. So you have the foundation for modern day Connecticut. Further with that, you have Roger Williams, who was a young minister in Salem, Massachusetts, who largely disagreed with much of the puritanical views and viewpoints in and around the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He was also somebody who was not going to align themselves and wanted to separate from the Church of England as well. He wanted to perhaps establish more religious freedom in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But he came under heavy fire from Puritans. So before he was exiled, he actually left and escaped. And he established a colony about 100 miles south of Boston and established the community we know today as Providence, Rhode Island. And among the native tribes whom he befriended and defended their native control over the land, he actually purchased a semi-large tract of land, we know it today as the state of Rhode Island, where he would create a community of people who would be free to practice religion at their discretion. There would be no formal religion. There is no theocracy. The idea of there being a separation of church and state would come from Roger Williams' interpretation of views and establishment of modern-day Rhode Island in Providence. So, you'll see the separation of church and state come to fruition in several chapters. Okay? But the idea that Roger Williams had so as to allow people to believe and worship freely in Rhode Island is now true. Now you don't even have to have Christians. Now you might have Jews. Okay? Otherwise, Catholics and Baptists and Puritans, if you want anything else, you can do all of that in Rhode Island without persecution or fear of such. So, you also have others in the colonies, like Anne Hutchinson, who would question elite interpretations of what grace means. People who would live a good life and declare themselves as Christian, therefore be saved. She would question some of the local theocracies who would deem some people to have lived in a certain way, typically favoring people of more elite status. She would be seen as a threat, especially because she was a woman. She would be seen as a threat to local theocratic establishment, and she would be driven out of Massachusetts, and those of her followers, even though she would eventually pass away, would see the territories just north of Massachusetts as being respite for an end to religious persecution. So what you see there are people who would colonize the areas of New England north of Massachusetts, namely New Hampshire and Maine. So the colonies and territories that we know, and states today that we know as Maine and New Hampshire, were largely established by people who were disciples of Anne Hutchinson, who rejected some of the theocratic establishment in Massachusetts Bay Colony. So you're starting to see how some of these New England colonies take shape. People who established it out of an escape from religious persecution, and people who established other colonies from that colony to escape from the original colony's persecution. It's amazing how that works in human history. Okay? So if you've ever wondered how some people in the United States come from such differing viewpoints, that's nothing new in this country. That goes back to our earliest colonial days where people who didn't agree with each other wanted to be free to practice whatever they wanted. Largely it was religious, others it was political. But generally speaking, people want an opportunity. And what makes people different in these New English colonies is that if they didn't like their situation, they had an opportunity to leave it. And they could do something else. Okay? That's what you're starting to see. Elsewhere in New England, you start to see a struggle, especially as people move into western parts of New England. People struggle with various different Native American tribes. And some Native American tribes who are very hostile to those in Massachusetts Bay Colony or in Connecticut or elsewhere. And throughout the region, you would see conflict. Some of these Native American tribes would actually side with the English because they were at odds with their Native American rivals. So you would see a small war that would eventually cause a lot of lives to be lost on both the English and Native American side, but it would largely decimate many of the different Native American numbers in modern day New England. And that would pave the way for more settlers to come into New England and take over. So as you have new technologies such as a flint musket that would be brought into the fray, and you have other European aspects come into play, including diseases too, you now started to see Native Americans being driven off. And because many of these Native Americans were resistant to the idea of having Europeans around, they were seen as warlike, when in reality they were just defending their way of life as it was being encroached. But the prevailing English thought among many of these English settlers was that these people are savages, these people are warlike, these people are angry and they want to kill us. That was the interpretation at the time. So you see some staunchly shifting attitudes towards Native Americans and how they are viewed by English settlers and then of course in England itself. So the image of Native Americans as being portrayed as savages begins to start to take root in this time frame, in the 1630s or so, with the establishment of many of these New England colonies. Elsewhere, prevailing ideas had also permeated, but it was really in this time that it became ingrained.